This is Chapter 4 of C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. It's called The Bell and the Hammer, and I'm Terry Bibo Knight, your reader. There was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness and then through a mass of vague and whirling shapes which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter. Then suddenly they felt that they were standing on something solid. A moment later, everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. "What a queer place," said Diggory. "I don't like it," said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they first noticed was the light. It wasn't like sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light or lamps or candles or any other light they had ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful. It was steady and did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in a sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. When you had seen that sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. "It's very funny weather here," said Diggory. "I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse." "I don't like it," said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers, and though there was no reason why they should still go on holding hands after their jump, they didn't let go. The walls rose very high all round that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly like the mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and the sharp corners were all worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled up with rubble. The two children kept on turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason was that they were afraid of somebody, or something, looking out of those windows at them with their backs turned. "Do you think anybody lives here?" said Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand still and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood still and listened, but all they could hear was the thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the quiet wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "Now we're here, we simply must have a look around." "I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting here. There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them after you got there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place." "I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is to remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You can keep your hand as near your pocket as you like, but don't put it in or you'll touch your yellow ring and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways which led into the inside of the building. And when they'd stood on the threshold and could look in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they had thought at first. It led into a vast, shadowy hall, which appeared to be empty, but on the far side there was a row of pillars with arches between them, and through those arches there streamed in some more of the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches and found themselves in another and larger courtyard. "That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall over into the courtyard. In one place, a pillar was missing between two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar ought to have been hung there with nothing to support it. Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. "If it's lasted till now, I suppose it'll last a bit longer," said Diggory, "but we must be very quiet. You know, a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps." They went on out of that courtyard into another doorway, and up a great flight of steps, and through vast rooms that opened out of one another till you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous palace. But each time they only got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places when people were still living there. In one there had once been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could see a bit of piping in the back of its mouth, out of which the water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was as dry as a bone. In other places there were the dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant which had wound itself round the pillars and helped to pull some of them down, but it had died long ago. And there were no ants or spiders or any of the living things you expect to see in a ruin, and where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstones there was no grass or moss. It was all so dreary and so much the same that even Diggory was thinking they had better put on their yellow rings and get back to the warm, green, living forest of the in-between place, when they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold. One stood a little ajar, so of course they went to look in. Both started back and drew a long breath, for here at last was something worth seeing. For a second they thought the room was full of people, hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Diggory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a long time, looking in. But presently they decided that what they were looking at could not be real people. There was not a movement nor the sound of a breath among them all. They were like the most wonderful waxworks you ever saw. This time Polly took the lead. There was something in this room which interested her more than it interested Diggory. All the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help going in to see them closer. And the blaze of their colors made this room look not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the others. It had more windows, too, and was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe those clothes. The figures were all robed and had crowns on their heads. Their robes were of crimson and silvery gray and deep purple and vivid green, and there were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts in needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness stared from their crowns and hung in chains around their necks and peeped out from all the places where anything was fastened. "Why haven't these clothes all rotted away long ago?" said Polly. "Magic," whispered Diggory. "Can't you feel? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in." "Any one of these dresses would cost hundreds of pounds," said Polly. But Diggory was more interested in the faces, and indeed these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on each side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and look at the faces in turn. "They were nice people, I think," said Diggory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and women looked kind and wise, and they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that looked a little different. These were very solemn faces. You felt you'd have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. When they'd gone a little further, they found themselves among faces they didn't like. This was about the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they looked cruel. A little further on they looked crueler, and further on again they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy. They were even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting, a woman even more richly dressed than the others, very tall, but every figure in that room was taller than the people of our world, with a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away. Yet she was beautiful, too. Years afterwards, when he was an old man, Diggory said he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. It's only fair to add that Polly always said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. This woman, as I said, was the last, but there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. "I do wish we knew the story that's behind all this," said Diggory. "Let's go back and look at that table sort of thing in the middle of the room." The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch from which there hung a little golden bell, and beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder, said Diggory. "There seems to be something written here," said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. "Well, by gum, so there is," said Diggory, "but of course we shan't be able to read it." "Shan't we? I'm not so sure," said Polly. They both looked at it hard, and, as you might have expected, the letters cut in the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found that they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he himself had said a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar. And very soon they both knew. What it said was something like this. At least this is the sense of it through the poetry. When you read it there, it was better. "Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had." "No fear," said Polly. "We don't want any danger." "Oh, but don't you see it's no good," said Diggory. "Can't get out of it now. We shall always be wondering what would have happened if we'd struck the bell. I'm not going home to be driven mad by always thinking of that. No fear." "Don't be so silly," said Polly, "as if anyone would. What does it matter what would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this is bound to go on wondering till it sends him dotty. That's the magic of it, you see. I can feel it beginning to work on me already." "Well, I don't," said Polly crossly, "and I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on." "That's all you know," said Diggory. "It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged." "You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that," said Polly. "Why can't you keep to the point?" said Diggory. "What we're talking about is—" "How exactly like a man," said Polly in a very grown-up voice. But she added hastily in her real voice, "And don't say I'm just like a woman, or you'll be a beastly copycat." "I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman," said Diggory loftily. "Oh, I'm a kid, am I?" said Polly, who was now in a real rage. "We needn't be bothered by having a kid with you any longer, then. I'm off. I've had enough of this place, and I have enough of you, too, you beastly, stuck-up, obstinate pig." "None of that," said Diggory, in a voice even nastier than he meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand moving to her pocket to get hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next, except by saying that he was very sorry for it afterwards, and so were a good many other people. Before Polly's hand reached her pocket, he grabbed her wrist, leaning across her with his back against her chest. Then, keeping her other arm out of the way with his other elbow, he leaned forward, picked up the hammer, and struck the golden bell a light, smart tap. Then he let her go, and they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing hard. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear, and not even because he'd hurt her wrist quite fairly badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels quite out of their minds. As soon as the bell was struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note, such as you might have expected, and not very loud. But instead of dying away again, it went on, and as it went on, it grew louder. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was soon so loud that if the children had tried to speak, but they weren't thinking of speaking now, they were just standing with their mouths open, they would not have heard one another. Very soon it was so loud they could not have heard one another even by shouting, and still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till all the air in that great room was throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise, which sounded first like the roar of a distant train, and then like the crash of a falling tree. They heard something like great weights falling. Finally, with a sudden rush and thunder, and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet, about a quarter of the roof at one end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all round them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped. The clouds of dust cleared away. everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to magic or whether that unbearably loud sound from the bell just happened to strike the note which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. "There. I hope you're satisfied now," panted Polly. "Well, it's all over anyway," said Diggory. And both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. And that is the end of Chapter 4. In Chapter 5, The Deplorable Word. The children were facing one another across the pillar where the bell hung, still trembling, though it no longer gave out any note. Suddenly they heard a soft voice from the end of the room which was still undamaged. They turned, quick as lightning, to see what it was. One of the robed figures, the furthest off one of all, the woman whom Diggory thought so beautiful, was rising from its chair. When she stood up, they realized that she was even taller than they had thought, and you could see at once, not only from her crown and robes, but from the flash of her eyes and the curve of her lips, that she was a great queen. She looked round the room and saw the damage and saw the children, but she could not guess from her face what she thought of either, or whether she was surprised. She came forward with long, swift strides. "Who has waked me? Who has broken the spell?" she asked. "I think it must have been me," said Diggory. "You," said the queen, laying her hand on his shoulder, a white, beautiful hand, but Diggory could feel that it was strong as steel pincers. "You? But you are only a child, a common child. Anyone can see at a glance that you have no drop of royal or noble blood in your veins. How did such as you dare to enter this house?" "You've come from another world by magic," said Polly, who thought it was high time the queen took some notice of her as well as of Diggory. "Is this true?" said the queen, still looking at Diggory and not giving Polly even a glance. "Yes, it is," said he. The queen put her other hand under his chin and forced it up so that she could see his face better. Diggory tried to stare back, but he soon had to let his eyes drop. There was something about hers that overpowered him. After she had studied him for well over a minute, she let go of his chin and said, "You are no magician. The mark of it is not on you. You must be only the servant of a magician. It is on another's magic that you have traveled here." "It was my Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. At the moment, not in the room itself, but from somewhere very close, there came first a rumbling, and then a creaking, and then a roar of falling masonry, and the floor shook. "There is great peril here," said the queen. "The whole palace is breaking up. If we are not out of it in a few minutes, we shall be buried under the ruin." She spoke as calmly as if she'd been merely addressing the time of day. "Come," she said, and held out a hand to each of the children. Polly, who was disliking the queen and feeling sulky, would not have let her hand be taken if she could have helped it, but though the queen spoke so calmly, her movements were as quick as thought. Before Polly knew what was happening, her left hand had been caught in a hand so much longer and stronger than her own that she could do nothing about it. "This is a terrible woman," thought Polly. "She's strong enough to break my arm with one twist, and now that she's got my left hand, I can't get at my yellow ring. If I tried to stretch across and get my right hand into my left pocket, I mightn't be able to reach it before she asked me what I was doing. Whatever happens, we mustn't let her know about the rings. I do hope Diggory has the sense to keep his mouth shut. I wish I could get a word with him alone." The queen led them out of the Hall of Images into a long corridor, and then through a whole maze of halls and stairs and courtyards. Again and again they heard parts of the great palace collapsing, sometimes quite close to them. Once a huge arch came thundering down only a moment after they had passed through it. The queen was walking quickly. The children had to trot to keep up with her, but she showed no sign of fear. Diggory thought, "She's wonderfully brave and strong. She's what I call a queen. I do hope she's going to tell us the story of this place." She did tell them certain things as they went along. "That is the door to the dungeons," she would say, or "that passage leads to the principal torture chambers," or "this was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles to a feast and killed them all before they had drunk their fill. They had had rebellious thoughts." They came at last into a hall larger and loftier than any they had yet seen. From its size, and from the great doors at the far end, Diggory thought that now at last they must be coming to the main entrance. In this he was quite right. The doors were dead black, either ebony or some black metal which is not found in our world. They were fastened with great bars. most of them too high to reach and all too heavy to lift. He wondered how they would get out. The queen let go of his hand and raised her arm. She drew herself up to her full height and stood rigid. Then she said something which they couldn't understand, but it sounded horrid, and made an action as though she were throwing something toward the doors. And those high and heavy doors trembled for a second as if they were made of silk, and then crumbled away till there was nothing left of them but a heap of dust on the threshold. "Whew!" whistled Diggory. "Has your master magician, your uncle, power like mine?" asked the queen, firmly seizing Diggory's hand again. "But I shall know later. In the meantime, remember what you have seen. This is what happens to things and to people who stand in my way." Much more light than they had yet seen in that country was pouring in through the now empty doorway, and when the queen had led them out through it, they were not surprised to find themselves in the open air. The wind that blew in their faces was cold, yet somehow stale. They were looking from a high terrace, and there was a great landscape spread out below them. Low down and near the horizon hung a great red sun, far bigger than our sun. Diggory felt at once that it was also older than ours, a sun near the end of its life, weary of looking down upon that world. To the left of the sun and higher up there was a single star, big and bright. Those were the only two things to be seen in the dark sky. They made a dismal group. And on the earth, in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, there spread a vast city in which there was no living thing to be seen. And all the temples, towers, palaces, pyramids, and bridges cast long, disastrous-looking shadows in the light of that withered sun. Once a great river had flowed through the city, but the water had long since vanished, and it was now only a wide ditch of gray dust. "Look well on that which no eyes will ever see again," said the queen. Such was Charn, that great city, the city of the King of Kings, the wonder of the world, perhaps of all worlds. Does your uncle rule any city as great as this, boy? "No," said Diggory. He was going to explain that Uncle Andrew didn't rule any cities, but the queen went on. "It is silent now, but I have stood here when the whole air was full of the noises of Charn, the trampling of feet, the creaking of wheels, the cracking of the whips, and the groaning of slaves, the thunder of chariots, and the sacrificial drums beating in the temples. I have stood here, but that was near the end, when the roar of battle went up from every street, and the river of Charn ran red." She paused and added, "All in one moment, one woman blotted it out forever." "Who?" said Diggory in a faint voice, but he had already guessed the answer. "I," said the queen, "I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world." The two children stood silent, shivering in the cold wind. "It was my sister's fault," said the queen. "She drove me to it. May the curse of all the powers rest upon her forever. At the moment I was ready to make peace, yes, and to spare her life, too, if only she would yield me the throne. But she would not. Her pride has destroyed the whole world. Even after the war had begun, there was a solemn promise that neither side would use magic. But when she broke her promise, what could I do? Fool! As if she did not know that I had more magic than she. She even knew that I had the secret of the deplorable word. Did she think, she was always a weakling, that I would not use it?" "What was it?" said Diggory. "That was the secret of secrets," said Queen Jadis. "It had long been known to the great kings of our race that there was a word which, if spoken with the proper ceremonies, would destroy all living things except the one who spoke it. But the ancient kings were weak and soft-hearted, and bound themselves and all who should come after them with great oaths, never even to seek after the knowledge of that word. But I learned it in a secret place and paid a terrible price to learn it. I did not use it until she forced me to. I fought and fought to overcome her by every other means. I poured out the blood of my armies like water." "Beast," muttered Polly. "The last great battle," said the queen, "raged for 3 days here in Charn itself. For 3 days I looked down upon it from this very spot. I did not use my power till the last of my soldiers had fallen, and the accursed woman, my sister, at the head of her rebels, was halfway up those great stairs that lead up from the city to the terrace. Then I waited till we were so close that we could see one another's faces. She flashed her horrible wicked eyes upon me and said, 'Victory.' 'Yes,' said I, 'victory, but not yours.'
Then I spoke the deplorable word. A moment later, I was the only living thing beneath the sun. "But the people," gasped Diggory. "What people, boy?" asked the Queen. "All the ordinary people," said Polly, "who'd never done any harm, and all the women and the children and the animals." "Don't you understand?" said the Queen, still speaking to Diggory. "I was the Queen. They were all my people. What else were they there for but to do my will?" "It was rather hard luck on them, all the same," said Diggory. "I'd forgotten that you were only a common boy. How should you understand the reasons of state? You must learn, child, that what would be wrong for you or for any of the common people is not wrong in a great queen such as I. The weight of the world is on our shoulders. We must be free from all rules. Ours is a high and lonely destiny." Diggory suddenly remembered that Uncle Andrew had used exactly the same words, but they sounded much grander when Queen Jadis said them, perhaps because Uncle Andrew was not 7 feet tall and dazzlingly beautiful. "What did you do then?" said Diggory. "I had already cast strong spells on the hall where the images of my ancestors sit, and the force of those spells was that I should sleep among them like an image myself, and need neither food nor fire, though it were 1,000 years, till one came and struck the bell and awoke me." "Was it the deplorable word that made the sun like that?" asked Diggory. "Like what?" said Jadis. "So big, so red, and so cold." "It has always been so," said Jadis, "at least for hundreds of thousands of years. Have you a different sort of sun in your world?" "Yes, it's smaller and yellower, and it gives a good deal more heat." The Queen gave a long-drawn "Ah," and Diggory saw on her face that same hungry and greedy look which he had lately seen on Uncle Andrew's. "So," she said, "yours is a younger world." She paused for a moment to look once more at the deserted city, and if she was sorry for all the evil she had done, she certainly didn't show it. And then she said, "Now let us be going. It is cold here at the end of all the ages." "Going where?" asked both the children. "Where?" repeated Jadis in surprise. "To your world, of course." Polly and Diggory looked at each other aghast. Polly had disliked the Queen from the first, and even Diggory, now that he had heard the story, felt that he had seen quite as much of her as he wanted. Certainly she was not at all the person one would like to take home, and if they did like, they didn't know how they could. What they wanted was to get away themselves, but Polly couldn't get at her ring, and of course Diggory couldn't go without her. Diggory got very red in the face and stammered, "Oh, our world. I didn't know you wanted to go there." "What else were you sent for, if not to fetch me?" asked Jadis. "I'm sure you wouldn't like our world at all," said Diggory. "It's not her sort of place, is it, Polly? It's very dull. Not worth seeing, really." "It will soon be worth seeing when I rule it," answered the Queen. "Oh, but you can't," said Diggory. "It's not like that. They wouldn't let you, you know." The Queen gave a contemptuous smile. "Many great kings," she said, "though they could stand against the house of Charn, tried. But they all fell, and their very names are forgotten. Foolish boy, do you think that I, with my beauty and my magic, will not have your whole world at my feet before a year has passed? Prepare your incantations and take me there at once." "This is perfectly frightful," said Diggory to Polly. "Perhaps you fear for this uncle of yours," said Jadis, "but if he honors me duly, he shall keep his life and his throne. I am not coming to fight against him. He must be a very great magician if he has found how to send you here. Is he the king of your whole world, or only of part?" "He isn't king of anywhere," said Diggory. "You are lying," said the Queen. "Does not magic always go with the royal blood? Who ever heard of common people being magicians? I can see the truth whether you speak it or not. Your uncle is the great king and the great enchanter of your world, and by his art he has seen the shadow of my face in some magic mirror or some enchanted pool, and for the love of my beauty he has made a potent spell which shook your world to its foundations, sent you across the vast gulf between world and world to ask my favor and to bring me to him. Answer me, isn't it not how it would have gone?" "Well, not exactly," said Diggory. "Not exactly," shouted Polly. "Well, it's absolute bosh from beginning to end." "Minion!" cried the Queen, turning in rage upon Polly and seizing her hair at the very top of her head where it hurts the most. But in doing so, she let go of both the children's hands. "Now!" shouted Diggory. "And quick!" shouted Polly. They plunged their left hands into their pockets. They did not even need to put the rings on. The moment they touched them, the whole of that dreary world vanished from their eyes. They were rushing upward, and a green, warm light was growing nearer overhead. And that's the end of chapter 5.